Thank you. I'm Mr. Lehner, and welcome back to Mr. Lehner's Math Extravaganza. In today's webisode, we're going to continue to build on prime factorization and factors and apply it to a real-life situation. So in the first video you saw for 3.1, we talked about actually just the process of how to do prime factorization and factor trees, but now we're actually going to apply it to some real-life situations where you can actually use this. So let's take a look at an example problem. In our example problem for factorization, it says Mr. and Mrs. Smith have 8 children. Each of those 8 children has 8 children. How many grandchildren do Mr. and Mrs. Smith have? Well, there's a lot of children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. There's a lot in this problem. So let's take a look. We know we have 2 parents, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. I know that they have 8 children. Okay, so they have 8 children. And each of those children has 8 children. So I'm kind of visualizing. I like to be a visual person. I'm visualizing 8 children and each of them having 8 children as well. What I'm trying to find out is how many grandchildren do Mr. and Mrs. Smith have. Now there's a multitude of ways, or many ways, that you can actually solve this problem. So a way that you might do it at home might be totally different. And again, like we've talked about, that's perfectly fine. There's more than one way to attack these problems. I'm going to show you a couple examples or a couple ways you could have done it. And again, yours may be different. So when labeling these, I make sure that I add on my units. So Mr. and Mrs. Smith had 8 children, and their children had 8 children. So I can use like multiplication here. And I can do the 8 children times 8 children is going to give me 64 grandchildren, because each of the child had 8 childs. So there's going to be 64 grandchildren, 64 grandchildren. There's a lot of words, you might get a little tongue twisted here. That's one way you could have done it. You use multiplication there to factor that out of 64, and 8 and 8, or 2 factors of 64. So you could have also done one child had 8 kids, another child had another 8 kids, third child had 8 kids, fourth child had 8 kids, fifth had 8 kids, sixth had 8 kids, seventh had 8 kids, and the 8th had 8 kids for 64 total grandchildren for Mr. and Mrs. Smith. So you could have actually just done the multiples of 8, and done 8 multiples of 8, and you still would have got 64 grandchildren. You might have also listed multiples going in order, multiples of 8, in terms of 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, 48, 56, and 64, and you're still going to come up with 64 grandchildren. You may have drawn a picture, and you may have put 1 child, 2 child, 3 child, and you actually could have drawn little sticks to point out each one of their kids and then counted each one and gone by 8s. That would have worked as well. There's tons of ways to solve it, and any would be perfectly fine to show that there are 64 grandchildren. Whew, that's a lot of kids, let me tell you. All right, let's take a look at your example. We're going to use what we've learned in that first portion to help us with the second portion. It now says each grandchild has 8 children of their own. How many great-grandchildren do Mr. and Mrs. Smith have now? So, using what we've done in the first problem, where there were 64 grandchildren, well now the 64 grandchildren, they each have 8 more. How many great-grandchildren do Mr. and Mrs. Smith have? And let me tell you, I probably wouldn't want to be Mr. and Mrs. Smith, because it'd probably be a little expensive for them to become grandparents. So I know you got paper ready, pencils out, ready to go. Go ahead, pause the video, and we'll see what you come up with. Okay, when looking at this problem, again, you're using what you've learned from our first problem. When looking, I knew that Mr. and Mrs. Smith had 8 children. Their children had 8 more children. And then their children had 8 more children. So basically, the original 8 childs that are children that Mr. and Mrs. Smith had 8 more childs. Those 8 childs had 8 more. So a way to think of this would be 8 times 8 times 8, which is going to give you 512, which stands for 512 great-grandchildren. Now, like I said, I don't think I'd want to be Mr. and Mrs. Smith, because if you're giving them like birthday gifts or special occasion gifts, that's a lot of money. Even if you gave them all like $1, that's $512, and that's just the great-grandchildren. Holy smoly. So that's a lot in there. You could have also wrote it out. We talked about prime factorization. Of the actual prime factorization of the number 512, it's really like 8 to the 3rd power. I can do 8 times 8 times 8, or 8 to the 3rd power, or 8 cubed equals 512. So there's another way using our prime factorization there to help us answer that question. So again, there's a lot of 8s in there, there's a lot of grandchildren, great-grandchildren, so in a problem like this, using our factors, I even threw in some multiples in the other example, using all this that we've learned so far can help us attack a question like this and actually give us some more wrinkles in our brain to make us just a little bit smarter when it comes to math. Thank you for tuning in to Miscellaneous Math Extravaganza. As always, we'll see you next time.